Peter Church. Do you see Najib as being completely safe, or do you see the many, many skeletons he's got in his closet, you know, of a Razak Baginda on the submarines and the Atulnya case with the Mongolian model? Are any of the people around him likely to tip him out?
Yes, you're right. Of course, Peter, he comes to office with a lot of political baggage. The two issues you mentioned, he has been linked, if indirectly, with the murder of a Mongolian woman, and he has failed to offer anything like an adequate explanation for that. What he did do was go to a mosque and make some declarations. And of course, he was defence minister for two long periods, and he presided over modernisation and great expansion of the Malaysian military. And there were some major purchases made, and almost on every one of those major purchases, there were heavy commissions paid, and often they were kicked back to supporters of UMNO. And in fact, there's a connection between the two, as you probably know, because Abdul Razak Baginda, who stood trial over the murder of the Mongolian women, he was a Najib advisor. He was found not guilty, but in one documented case, his own company got the more than $100 million commission for the purchase of the submarines. Najib's attitude has been basically just to ride it out, to say nothing and hope it'll all go away. He has some help from the so-called, the bureaucracy, of course, is totally politicised after 50 years of UMNO being in power. So the police force often acts as an extension of the ruling party of the government. And at one stage, the police actually put a condition on the opposition that when you hold these by-elections, you are not allowed to mention the name of the Mongolian woman's name, and you're not allowed to hold up photos of her. So you can see that this was a potent symbol, and the opposition had taken, especially in Anwar's party, it took to chanting this woman's name. And of course, it's extremely embarrassing to have a leader of a country who's linked to a murder. And but so far, it doesn't seem to have done him any undue damage. So he's hoping to ride it out. I guess other issues come to the fore. So. At this stage, he looks like he will be able to not really get rid of that baggage, but put it to one side for the time being. And I guess he's got enough current issues on his mind and without worrying about those.
Just there in the middle.
Wendy John, Jones Lang LaSalle. Thank you. I was delighted to listen to your concise and informative speech. You more than alluded to the future of Malaysia being not particularly rosy. What is the nature of that not so rosy future, and do you think there's going to be a ripple effect across that part of Asia?
I don't expect any. To take the last part of your question first, I don't expect any ripple effect outside. Since Dr. Mahathir's departure in 2003, foreign policy has ceased to be important to Malaysia. It's maintained its foreign policy, but without Mahathir's flamboyant gestures and this sort of thing, without some of the rhetoric. Malaysia has repaired its relations with since Dr. Mahathir's departure with countries like Australia, Singapore, and the US. But by and large, the focus is very much domestic. I just think the future is, it revolves around race and religion, and the fact that the entire system is totally corrupt in every possible way and badly in need of reform. The economy is in need of reform in so many different ways. The affirmative action program is being abused, and it's making Malaysia uncompetitive, and there's just no willpower there to clean up the mess. And if that situation goes on, Malaysia is just simply going to keep falling behind its neighbours in the way it competes. And there's always the danger of outbreak of some sort of violence, although I'm not suggesting for 1 minute the place is going to go up in flames. And gradually, it's going to fail to attract the foreign investment because it just simply, domestic investment is already falling catastrophically. And foreign investors have options. And first of all, they've got China and India, but also you've got neighbouring countries like Vietnam and others and places to go. So it's simply going to slide. You can see the corruption. You can tell by Transparency International's annual index, Malaysia is becoming even more corrupt. It's falling down on the list. If the opposition can't win, then I just see that this kind of unhappy situation just dragging on. And it's not so much that there'll be an explosion. That's not that likely. It's just a continued slow deterioration.
Gillian MacDonald, you referred to the GFC and its effect and, of course, corruption and difficulties with the economy. I wonder if you could just walk us through a little bit more on the economy and what the story is over the last, in more detail, over the last decade or so.
Malaysia's overall macroeconomic growth figures look reasonable, and as it seeks to come out of the global meltdown of the last 18 months, again it looks reasonable. It went into deficit last year, negative growth last year, but it expects to grow again this year. The government has used two lots of stimulus packages amounting to 67 billion ringgit. But I think this masks the fact that Malaysia is not doing as well as its immediate neighbours. As I mentioned, it is becoming apparent, although the numbers have been used in such a way as to mask the reality, domestic investors have not been willing to invest much in the last 10 years. The drop is just described recently by an economist specialising in Malaysia as catastrophic. If this is predominantly because of the affirmative action program. Of course, a lot of that money is ethnic Chinese. There's no faith in the future of Malaysia. People are continuing to emigrate. The numbers, I think the estimate, since affirmative action started in 1970, there's an estimate of like 500,000 to 1 million people have left Malaysia. And of course they tend to be the people with the best qualified and the best brains. A lot of them are in Singapore. So first of all, far from bringing back any of those people, you have to get policies in place that might encourage them to return. But first of all, you've got to stop them going. As it is, people now, we listened to a Malay speaker the other day to say now the estimate is that 3,000 Malays have gone in the last few years. And so the best of the brightest of the Malays are leaving. They just don't see a future in which there's somehow the country is pulling together and there's some accommodation between the races. Without going too much into the economy, it's still overly dependent on oil and gas. Nearly 45% of government revenue comes from oil and gas, and this is a diminishing resource. There's a limited number of Malaysians who pay tax. That has to be sorted out. There's talk about bringing in a goods and services tax, and they may do that. It's caught in what is called a low-income trap. To move to the next higher level, all sorts of reforms, but essentially that affirmative action program has to be tackled, and it is politically very, very difficult, almost impossible, to start interfering with those benefits that go to Malays, particularly the members of UMNO, the ones who benefit. They will resist, along with Malay nationalists, they resist any attempt to do that. While that affirmative action program stays in place like it is, it amounts to a tax on the economy, a tax on investors, and a heavy one at that. And they're just simply, it's hard to see. The economy is not going to break down. It's just going to sort of slowly register much lower growth rates over the longer term.
One at the back there.
And there has been talk of one or two states in Malaysia adopting Sharia law. Is this, and would it have an effect? I imagine it would have a deleterious effect on economic development.
Well, going back for Richard, good to see you, and Alison, with whom I used to work in the years before I left Australia. Several states, including those run by Party Islam, have adopted aspects of Sharia law going back a long time. They can't be implemented because it's against the federal constitution. So that's where that stands, and I guess there's no real danger of the constitution being changed to that effect, because you would need the support of the non-Muslims as well to change the constitution, and that's not likely to come. Having said that, this creeping Islamisation and the growing power of the conservative Muslims that I referred to, a lot of it has resulted partly from the worldwide resurgence in Islam, and partly because of this competition between UMNO, Dr. Mahathir's UMNO, and Party Islam. They tried to outdo each other and became more militant. And almost unnoticed, UMNO, which once stood for moderation, simply became radical on this issue of Islam. It's still not clearly understood. On this issue of Islam, of Allah, that came up last month, I mean, you can see it quite clearly. Party Islam, PAS, which always stood for an Islamic state, regarded as prone to radicalism. Party Islam, as part of the opposition now, Anwar's opposition, Party Islam accepted the court's ruling, accepted that Christians in Malaysia could use, as they have used for decades, and as happens throughout the rest of the world, the word Allah, an Arabic word that precedes Islam's arrival in the Arabian Peninsula, in their publications. They gave an explanation to their followers in religious terms, and that's accepted. UMNO, the party of moderation, does not accept that ruling, does not accept that Christians can use the word Allah in the Malay language, and has challenged it in court. So it's quite obvious in that example who's extreme. Somehow or other, they're going to have to, try and back off from this situation, and try and, it needs political leadership to, restore some faith on both sides and bring it back into some sort of. The space for the races and the religions to interact has been narrowing in Malaysia. Fortunately, as a result of this issue, there's now the government is now talking in terms of an interfaith dialogue. I should point out that under Abdullah Badawi, the last Prime Minister, who had excellent Islamic credentials, who could speak with authority, he shut down the attempted interfaith dialogue because conservative Muslims demonstrated outside the room. Now, when people demonstrate against the government, they bring in the police and hose them down or arrest their leaders under the ISA. In this particular case, because a relatively handful of conservatives demonstrated for the second meeting of the interfaith dialogue, he shut down the dialogue in the interests of peace on the street. So, again, it's an example of where UMNO has not provided the leadership that's necessary for good sense and moderation to prevail.
Thank you, David Cohen. My question also has to do with Sharia law. I think I understood you to say that Sharia law was now on a level with the secular judiciary. My question is, what implications, if any, does that have for the Anwar trial?
It doesn't have any implication for Anwar's trial. It has implications for people involved in those marriages, say a non-Muslim household, where one party, say, and there's been several examples recently where the father, the husband, converts to Islam. Under the law, someone can only be married to a Muslim if they are Muslim themselves. Otherwise, you break the law. If the spouse in that particular case doesn't want the children, the family, to be raised as Muslims and doesn't want to become Muslim herself, she would normally go to the court to settle it, go to the civil law courts. Because they're on a co-equal status, in several of these cases, they've gone to the civil law courts, and the civil law courts said, no, this involves Islam and family matters. You've got to go to a Sharia court. It's this woman who's been a Hindu all her life and has raised her children to be Hindus and everything else. I've got to go to a Sharia court to sort this out. So the civil law courts are saying at the government level, you have got to legislate this and make this clear. You can't expect the courts to solve this issue. That's where it is. And there've been a lot of again, there was a famous case known as Lena Joy, where someone who was basically under the Constitution, every Malay is a Muslim. Freedom of religion is guaranteed in the Constitution, but it's qualified in the sense that under the Constitution, every Malay is a Muslim. Now, if a Muslim wants to leave his religion, his or her religion, he has to go to a Sharia court. Mostly that will be denied. So in this one particular case where someone has been practicing, born a Malay, so technically born a Muslim, but been converted to Christianity and been living as a Christian, to go and get formal recognition of that so he could marry her Christian fiancé, was denied. So Lena Joy is believed to have emigrated so that she could marry.
Carlton Hughes. In a slightly different direction, Malaysia for a long period of time was a pioneer in developing Islamic finance and Islamic finance mechanisms. Has this era passed? Is there any, with the development of the Islamic finance and financing methods worldwide, has this sort of left Malaysia behind, or is Malaysia still pitching?
Malaysia is definitely still pitching, and I can't answer that definitively. Frankly, I'm not following it close enough to know, but I'm under the impression that Malaysia is still doing quite well in Islamic financing and has a lot of smart bankers and people in that field, and is quite competitive still internationally.
Down here.
I'm wondering, does Malaysia have any special relationship with the Saudi Arabia, not only because there's been significant Saudi financing of madrasas in Asia generally, but I've wondered if both on the business front and on the religious front, if there is a growing influence from, say, Wahhabism type of Islam in Malaysia.
No, there's not the sort of influence you're referring to. That's not an issue there. The issue is mainly homegrown Muslims. They do go to the Middle East, mainly to Egypt, and study and they come back probably more conservative. It's true, but not Wahhabism is not an issue really in Malaysia. It's of a different kind. It's peculiar to Malaysia, and they are quite wary of extremists coming in from outside. And although they've been caught out a couple of times, of course, with some of the militants, and in fact some of the people from the 9/11 attacks having passed through Malaysia or done some negotiations on Malaysian soil. They're now onto them, and recently I think there was something like 10 people a few weeks ago, 10 people detained under the ISA, most of them foreigners, clearly most of them regarded as radical Muslims. So they're detained, they're not identified, they're detained under the Internal Security Act, and they'll probably be held and maybe deported, but they're wary of extremists.
Thank you. David Storr. You mentioned that Malaysia's been off our radar for a while. What is Malaysia's perception of Australia, either in the press or in the public or whatever? Is there any sort of consciousness of us as a nation or the relationship currently?
I think at the personal level, there's always been Malaysian students and others who come to Australia, and I think probably the perception at that level is quite favourable. It became mixed under Dr. Mahathir because he conducted, he had an acrimonious relationship with nearly every Australian Prime Minister on his watch, 3 particularly, and even a 4th, and Malcolm Fraser. As I mentioned, at the government level now, foreign policy is not a priority at all, so there's not a lot of mention of Australia. So no, not a. The Malaysian press carries occasional stories, but there's nothing singled out. It's just they would run stories about Australia in the local papers in the same way as they run them about most other countries.
Yes, I was interested in your comments there about the Bumiputra policy and linking it with the drop-off in foreign investment. Has there in recent years been any changes to foreign investment policy or practice there? Because, you know, the percentage that the government is able to nominate should go into the hands of one of its followers has been quite a deterrent in my experience, and I just wondered if there are any signs they're relaxing that at all.
Yeah, when I referred to Najib having made a couple of taken a couple of economic measures that were positive, he has made an adjustment. I think when you list now a company in Malaysia, before you had to give 30% to Bumiputra investors, and sometimes it was difficult, of course, to find those investors, so they were given, but of course UMNO usually provided the friendly investor, and the problem with the policy is, of course, then the Bumiputra investor in most cases has just sold on the shares immediately and not held them for the purpose for which they originally allocated, which is to hold a long-term equity. So now if there is not a ready partner, you can foreign companies in certain areas can list 100% on the market without getting a Bumi partner. It is limited. It's a step in the right direction. Of course, I heard one of the Malaysian government-linked economists describe it the other day as just a tiny step. It's an important step, but there's a lot more to go. But yes, they have made that a gesture. But overall, it's still just a huge tax on companies to operate in Malaysia. And frankly, in the past, even in the good times, when the Malaysian economy was galloping along at 9 or 10% a year for a decade, you could absorb those huge margins and losses. Now, those good times are over. Boom times are over. The Malaysian economy is not going to grow like that anymore ever again. Realistically, 4 or 5% is the thing. And there isn't that margin now for corporations to absorb and to pay off. So they're going to have to do a lot more reform to make it worthwhile for corporations.
Barry, I might reserve the last question for myself. Does Dr. Mahathir have a particular hatred of Australia, or do we just get the same treatment as most Western countries? And if he does, why?
There is a particular history to Mahathir's relationship with Australia and his dislike, and it refers to the time, it goes back to the time when in the 1969 election, before the election, the Malaysian government approached Dr. Mahathir to get him to come to Australia on one of these sponsored programs that the Foreign Affairs Department runs to bring promising politicians and other people from abroad to Australia to learn about the country and become involved. And after he lost his seat in the 1969 elections, the Australian government said to him, look, there's been a bit of a problem with the finances. We've run out this year, and if you could postpone it. So Dr. Mahathir, being a rather thin-skinned individual, took this to mean they wanted me before, now I've lost my seat, they don't want me anymore. And I raised it with him, and it was like 39 years later, and he could remember it very, very vividly. And I said, do you think they did it deliberately? And he said, I don't know, but they cancelled it. So that was the start of a bad relationship, and he has a very long memory, particularly anyone who delivers insults or slights to him. He would have taken exception anyway because of the nature of Australia. Politicians and the press in Australia are quite outspoken, and he is a Malay nationalist, a Malaysian nationalist, and he really doesn't like those sort of freewheeling comments made about him and made about his country.
Okay. Barry, look, that was absolutely fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully, I don't think anyone in this room would need convincing that Malaysia is important, that there are incredibly important transitions that are going on within Malaysia that will really impact on the broader region and on this country. And the story you tell about Dr. Mahathir and his making of modern Malaysia in all of its faults and positive sides is a fascinating one. So I'm certainly looking forward to having a chance to read your book. Ladies and gentlemen, could you join me in thanking Barry Wain?
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks, Barry.